it suddenly occurred to me that this is actually the third SPA conference I've spoken at on the subject of Brexit. And I must admit, the first time I did it, I would have been quite surprised to be back for a third time. I didn't rather think it would be done by then. I'm just pleased that there is such a beautiful view out there. So if you get bored with Brexit, there is something slightly more entertaining for you to look at. And I am very grateful for my colleague from Bays, Ian, to be here today, because I think, excuse me, the potential effects of a no deal Brexit are something that are going to engage both the government and industry together in what is going to be a common and shared effort for the UK economy. And I think having those close relationships with Bays is a great thing for the box industry. It's a great thing for the Sheep Plant Association. And I would strongly encourage people to talk to Ian at any point during the proceedings today and build those relationships and build that confidence, because it is, I think, potentially going to be of great importance to us. So, before I start on these key messages, could I just, on behalf of the Confederation of Paper Industries, add our congratulations to you, Tim, and to the Sheep Plant Association for your 100 conferences. I think that's a fantastic achievement. It's great to have so many people with a common interest in the room together. I only wish I had something better to talk about than Brexit. But as I said, two key messages. Message number one is there is a distinct risk of a no-deal Brexit. I couldn't put a percentage on it, but it is a very, very real risk. And the second key message I'd like to leave you with is, given that risk to your business, you need to do something about it. There are plans and actions that you can take today that would improve the robustness of your business faced with the prospect of a no-deal Brexit. And if there's nothing else you take away from today, take away those two things on the Brexit issue, and I'm sure that they will be something that will stand you in great stead for the future. So where are we currently? And this was the bit, Tim, I was sweating on the most, on the grounds that it could almost certainly be wrong, having written it at any particular point in time. But I think this is fairly clear. Firstly, the UK is scheduled to leave on the 31st of October. In the Queen's speech today, the government has reiterated that that is its priority. Clearly, there are three things that need to happen. Firstly, there needs to be a deal done. Secondly, that deal then needs to be ratified in the UK Parliament. And thirdly, that deal needs to be ratified by the European Parliament. None of those steps have yet been achieved. They are all still outstanding. And of course, as we know, the UK government, the Parliament and the courts are now in conflict as to who has the power to do what, when, where and how. And nobody knows how that's going to turn out. And I'm certainly not going to speculate here today, because the only thing I know with certainty is that whatever I say will be wrong. But what I will do is I'll perhaps offer you some pointers. Things that you may observe in the news that might give you a guide to where things are going. The first is, if it all goes quiet in the negotiations, you don't hear anything in the news, there are no press briefings from the EU or the UK side, to my interpretation, that means that things will be getting somewhere where it's interesting and a deal may be close. You might have heard mention in the news of this thing called the tunnel, where the negotiators go into these very closed, intense sessions. They talk amongst each other in great detail about the issues. And that, I think, is a good sign that we're getting close to an agreement with the EU, if we're into that tunnel and the news flow stops as a result. The second thing I would say is about the politics. The European Union is a very technical organisation, and there's been a lot of talk about getting the technical detail absolutely right. If we start hearing more about the politics, more about the desirability of getting a deal, that would suggest to me that perhaps a deal might be getting closer, because the technical detail is being put into the future to be dealt with at that future point, and the political expedient and requirement to have an agreement is starting to override the technical need for it to be absolutely precise before anybody signs on the dotted line. And you've seen a bit of that already over the weekend, even Michel Barnier talking about the potential for things to be sorted out after the agreement has been reached, things being done in principle rather than being absolutely legally sorted out before the deadline date. And the third thing I think to look at is what goes on in the UK Parliament. Look at the Labour Party. There are 19 Labour MPs who've sent a letter to the government saying that they will be prepared to support a deal. At the moment, the government doesn't have a majority, and it's going to be very difficult for any deal to be ratified by the UK Parliament. So look for British politicians starting to align themselves behind a potential deal, because that will give a leading sign that perhaps whatever gets agreed might be ratified and might actually become a deal that would be agreed, would be ratified by the UK Parliament. Let's not take for granted the need for the European Parliament to ratify as well. That's not also a done deal, although I think it's much easier than the UK Parliament ratifying. So, as I said, I can't tell you what's going to happen, but these are perhaps some leading indicators that you may see over the next few days and weeks that might give you a sense of where things are going to end up. All of them. No, can you advance me to the next slide? Thank you. Oh, there we go. And then the one after that, please, Alan. Okay, so what I really want to spend the bulk of today talking about is key risks of no deal. Sorry, not the bulk of today, the bulk of the next 10 minutes or so. Just you. I really want to focus on the key risks of no deal. So look at these areas. There's 8 areas there: trade, logistics, customs, customer and supplier exposure, regulations, legal and contractual employment, communications and reputation. Ian and I have coordinated in advance. There's perhaps a little bit of overlap with regard to what we're going to say, but actually I don't think that's a bad thing, because it means that you can see the point from a business side as well as from a government official side. We don't always necessarily see things in exactly the same way. So let's start with the first of those, which is trade. Alan, if you'd like to... Thank you. So we're looking at this in the risk assessment terms. Well, what I want to do is to try and get people to understand what are their key risks. Key risk number 1 is that you might not be able to trade as easily with the EU27 as you have been. And there are a variety of concerns about this. The first is the EU27 and the UK have no tariffs on paper and its products, and that's a good thing. It means the chances of tariff barriers on boxes being imposed are effectively minimal to non-existent. However, there are going to be tariffs reimposed both on the EU side for the common external tariff and on the UK side for certain imported products into the UK in the event of a no deal Brexit. People therefore need to be clear what the tariff position potentially is for any products that they might be importing over and above the paper and boxes that they're using. And there's also the whole sense of non-tariff barriers. What kind of compliance checks will take place on the border? In reality, nobody quite knows what sort of customs checks are going to be put into place. But there's a clear likelihood that there will be some checks. And in some areas, we do have some clarity. So, for example, on recovered paper shipments, when we leave the EU27, we know that we're going to fall back to the Basel Convention regime. The Basel Convention regime allows the importing country to have inspections of recovered paper shipments going into that country. So we know that there are going to be inspections imposed. The challenge is not being entirely sure at this point, because we think it will be down to each individual member state what they do, how much those rules will be enforced and how they will be enforced. Second issue is, of course, to do with rules of origin. Rules of origin basically are what is the legal country of origin of the products that you're producing. And normally you see these for preferential trade agreements. So you have a rule of origin that says I'm entitled to this preferential tariff, this zero tariff regime perhaps, in a free trade area. But actually they're also important for things like statistics. They're important to make sure you don't fall foul of anti-dumping and countervailing duty cases that the European Union may have. And the question is really, could you as a company comply with understanding the legal origin of the goods that you're supplying? And that is something that I know a lot of companies haven't really had to engage with in the past, but it may well become something that you do need to engage with going forward in the event of a no deal Brexit. Second major risk is the risk to disruption of logistics. Put simply, is the port at Dover and the other channel ports potentially going to grind to a halt? You may have heard in the news of Operation Brock and Operation Yellowhammer. Back in 2015, when there was a ferry strike, there were lengthy delays at the Channel ports. A photograph there is from 2015. It shows the M20 being used as the lorry park. And clearly, if there are logistical challenges, the things that you need to do are based on building yourself a buffer and some cushion behind it. I was talking to one of your colleagues over lunch about the stockpiling that they've already done for many of their input raw materials, and I think there's a real need for people to think of what are the products that we are getting imported from the European Union on a regular basis. Can we stockpile them? Can we make sure that we've got a buffer of a few days in order to make sure that if there are real logistical challenges at the border, we can deal with whatever delays to shipments might be taking place. This colleague was also talking about getting away from the Channel ports and moving from ro-ro freight to containerised freight as a way of getting more space in their operation, longer sea routes, more opportunity for the documentation and the goods to actually catch up at the same time. And also the need to talk to your hauliers, making sure that the right driving and vehicle licence arrangements are in place. There has been some talk of temporary arrangements to enable UK licensed lorries and drivers to continue to operate in the European Union, but that talk took place in March, and people need to talk to their hauliers now to make sure that those temporary arrangements are still going to be in place and that they will provide some period of time before the regulations diverge in the event of no deal. UK driving licences are no longer valid, and UK vehicle licensing also is required to be duplicated with EU vehicle licensing. So on the customs side, there's also risk that incorrect documents will lead to delays in shipments. And the key point here is, do you or anybody within your organisation have experience of trading outside the EU, EEA and EFTA? What documentation would you need? The government has already started issuing EORI numbers to anybody who, I believe, Ian, it's any VAT registered business is getting an EORI number? Yes. So that is an opportunity then, that's basically it's a GB EORI number, which means that you're then registered as an economic operator for export purposes, and it enables you to plug into the necessary customs bureaucracy to be able to get your exports dealt with across the EU border. I would strongly encourage you to go to BEI's website. Ian will talk more about that in his presentation, but there are a series of flowcharts there. What do you do if you're importing materials? What do you do if you're exporting materials? What do you do in terms of vehicle logistics and movements? They are well worth reading, learning, following, and putting the lessons from those flowcharts into your own business planning for the next few weeks and months. Again, also look at the HMRC Partnership Pack. It's regularly updated, and in a no-deal situation, that would replace the Union Customs Code in the UK. HMRC regularly updating this, so I would get a look at it on the website and have a good look at what HMRC are asking. And it's understanding what border checks will be in place. What documents are customs officers at the border going to expect to see? Listening to various government sources, the expectation are anything between half and 80% of vehicles are going to arrive at ports with the wrong documentation. And so people need to really doubly, triply, quadruply check. Have they got the right documentation? Do they know what documents are required? Because the mismatch between the documentation and the product is going to be the major cause of delays at the ports, and that's going to be the major challenge for people actually being able to continue to operate as they have done so before. So what then are going to be customer and supplier exposure to Brexit? Because one of the major risks is that your customers and suppliers may not be able to trade with you. And these are really almost banally stupid questions, but actually it's understanding where you fit in to your customer and supplier web. Not just who potentially are your customers, but who are their customers. Because if the ultimate user of the box is a food and drink exporter, and that food and drink exporter can't then export because of licensing and other requirements as a result of a no deal Brexit, then all of that will come back to you in terms of their demand for your boxes. So the most important thing is to communicate. to talk to your customers, to talk to your suppliers, to understand what their risks are so that you can understand better what your risks are and work together to build a joint plan for how you're going to manage potential disruption going forward. Because all of these sectors here, food and drink, aerospace, automotive, chemicals, machinery, equipment and spares, they are all subject to European standards. They're all going to be subject to various European product safety certification regimes. In the event of a no deal Brexit, the UK will overnight sit outside of those regimes. And in purely bureaucratic regulatory terms, it will be very difficult for trade to continue unimpeded in the short term. And that will have a direct impact on your own businesses as suppliers into all of those businesses. Next area is regulatory stability. There are a very, very large number, hundreds, maybe even thousands of EU regulations that have a direct impact on the UK market. So, if I can pick two at random from that list, the EU eco-label. Eco-label applies to paper products. Well, the UK will be leaving the EU eco-label in the event of a no deal Brexit. That doesn't mean that UK products can no longer receive the eco-label, but you would need to go through another European country for your certification and your testing and so on for your compliance. And again, you would need to make arrangements to do that in order to be able to continue to use the EU eco-label sign. You see the EUTR, the EU timber regulation. That's a regulation which is designed to prevent illegally harvested timber from getting onto the market. Now clearly that is paper and its products that it covers, but it also covers things like transport pallets. And in the event of a no deal Brexit, there's a potential overnight change in the compliance requirements of UK exporters of pulp and paper products and also of UK users of transport pallets, that those pallets will need a different certification, they will need different sets of testings and requirements and so on, and that again could be a reason for an EU 27 customs officer to stop a shipment at the border because the paperwork is not complete for the EU timber regulation requirements for the pallets on which the products are being shipped. Now all of this depends upon how quickly the law is changed, how rapidly these new regulations are implemented on the border, but so far as I can see, in the event of a no deal Brexit, the European Union will have an incentive to make the biggest difference between being in and being out as they can as quickly as possible. And where there are these regulatory challenges, they will seek to put a marker down and say, you're outside our system, so you need to comply with our regulations as an outside country, and you cannot prove you've done so. So, again, this is a potential further cause of a barrier for change. Finally, on the bottom left, people may have talked about the EU emissions trading scheme. All of that would potentially be swept away in the event of a no deal Brexit, and instead there'd be a flat carbon tax in the UK of £16 a tonne, which is a completely different way of looking at emissions trading. So as you can see from a regulatory side, all of these risks are potentially there. They may damage the ability of your business to trade with the European Union, and these are risks that you need to try and grasp and manage at this point going forwards. Another area is legal and contract certainty. So are there, for example, anything in your contracts that mention the UK's membership of the EU? Or perhaps you can only fulfil if you are a member of the EU? Let me give you an example. It might say somewhere in one of your contracts that you will only use REACH-registered chemicals. But if your chemical supplier comes from the UK, in the event of a no deal Brexit, they won't be able to certify under REACH. And therefore, technically, you'll be in breach of contract. Might not matter. But on the other hand, if your counterparty is somebody who really wants to focus on these things, they might decide it's sufficient for you to be in breach of contract and for them to take action accordingly. Similarly, do your contracts say anything about Brexit-related disruption preventing you from meeting a contractual requirement? So, for example, do you have requirements to be on time and in full, which might be disrupted in the event of logistics problems going across the channel? Do you have any warranties, terms and conditions that perhaps you won't be able to meet as a result of being outside the EU? And also, do you potentially have either employment contracts or potentially service commitments? So perhaps you have a contract that says we would send a service engineer to a customer site in France in the event of there being a problem with the use of our boxes. Perhaps you won't be able to do that in future because that person wouldn't have the right to work in France as a result of changes in right to work law in the event of a no deal Brexit. You know, all of these are potential challenges that people need to try and understand what's the risk in their own business and how can they best mitigate against that risk. Talked a little bit about employment. Clearly one of the side effects from Brexit is that you may use your skilled and experienced employees from outside the UK. There's a cut-off date, assuming the UK leaves the EU, of the 31st of October 2019. You may have heard some talk about this EU settlement scheme. In order to be accepted for settled status, you need 5 years of residence up to the date at which you apply. Otherwise, you get what's called pre-settled status, which you can then convert to settled status if you have the 5 years. The deadline to apply in the event of no deal is the 31st of December 2020. So I gather around 2 million of the 3 million people who are inside the UK have already applied for this, but that means 1 million haven't. And listening to the Home Secretary over the weekend, it's clear that the UK government is determined to use the full force of immigration law against those people who don't have the correct documentation when the time comes that these processes have come to an end. And obviously that has an effect on your current staff, it has an effect on your future staffing needs. What recruitment processes would you use? How will you manage your non-UK workforce to take into account these new rules without falling foul of discrimination rules? And it's not just your own staff, it's also your subcontractors and your service staff. Everything from your office cleaners to your vehicle drivers to all of those service staff who you're also engaging in your business, making sure that they're also understanding of the situation, where entitled to settled status they've applied for it, and that you know that they're going to be regularising their position and able to work in the UK for the foreseeable future. Talked a bit about communications before, but it's absolutely paramount. The risk to your trading relations, your staff morale and your reputation if you don't communicate is potentially extremely high. And I would encourage you all to communicate to your employees, your workforce, your customers and your suppliers to make sure your communications instill confidence that you've understood the risks to your business, that you have a plan in place to manage them, and that you know that regardless of what happens on the 31st of October, you'll be in a position to continue to operate, continue to service your customers, continue to provide good, worthwhile employment to the people who work for you. And also, not only what do you need to tell people about your own preparations, but what questions do you need to ask of them? Because it's about understanding how you all fit together within the supply chain and supply web that you're part of, that you'll understand where the systemic risks are and how your supply web collectively can operate to minimise those risks. So really this is a risk management exercise, and there are 3 principal conclusions. What can your business control and or influence? What would be most likely to cause an impact? Which of those impacts would be most damaging? And then last of all, need to act now on the conclusions of that thought. There's only about 16 days to go, 17 days to go until the 31st of October, but it isn't too late. I strongly encourage people to look at these issues now. CPI is running a couple of Brexit seminars that are free, one on the 22nd of October at the Chesterford Grange Hotel, and one on the 24th of October in Bolton at the hotel in the Bolton Football Stadium. Please, if you can, you think it would be useful to you, come to those events. We'll be going through some of these issues in more detail, particularly with a lawyer who covers some of the regulatory and employment issues. But this is a real, clear, present challenge to all businesses in the UK now, and I would urge you to do as much as you can to understand your own risks, to plan and manage them accordingly. These links will be on the presentations when they're distributed. These are the key links for the key issues that I talked about today. And thank you very much.